a lot this year. It was hard for me. I don't know where people are. I don't know your backgrounds with disability. I don't know what you know about inclusion. So just kind of starting with a real general overview and some of my why. But if there's anything you want to learn more about or anything that you're like, don't, keep talking to us about that, we know that, just please give me that feedback. So we're going to talk today about the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that's federal law, and then a philosophy, my favorite one, called Universal Design for Learning, and then also talk about universal accommodations and planning for inclusion. So I don't just want to talk about inclusion today and say be inclusive. We also want to give you some tools for how to do that in your classrooms. Okay, so for a little warm-up, I want you to think of a time that you tackled a challenge. What made it challenging? What planning and preparation did you do? What things did you put into place to help yourself and prepare for success? Talk about, were you successful, why or why not, and then share with a neighbor. So I think examples are always helpful. Examples are a nice universal accommodation. So my example is that I recently tackled a challenge. I started a new exercise class at the gym. What makes it challenging is that we run on treadmills at like a 15% incline. So I'm pretty sure that's how I'm going to make the news. It's just flying off the back of that treadmill. For planning and preparation, I watched a video of the class. Something I did to help myself be successful is I made my husband go with me, like buddy system. I guess I was successful in terms of myself, but not if you compare me to everyone else in the class. I think it did help. All the things I did for myself to help prepare for that class did help my success. So go ahead and turn to your neighbors. You guys can talk about this right now.
Yeah, she told me that I think they were great. She's an amazing person. summer.
Okay, it looks like some of you are wrapping up. I don't want to interrupt Brad Greer, though. It looks like he's telling a really good story over there. So his hand's going. What challenge did you tackle over there, Greer? Did it have to do with like getting a drink in Mexico?
My daughter had an abscess on her gums in Mexico, and she had 2 baby teeth that needed to be removed.
In Mexico?
Tuesday in Cancun. So there's a bit of a challenge. I speak pequeño español, you know,
Totally fine, yeah.
and a little Spanglish. And, so anyway, we get to the dentist in Mexico is in the hospital. We found out, and that we went to the 2nd floor, and she's too little. They say, how old is she? And I'm like 6. Yeah. You know, like I got that one. And so, but she didn't tell us, or it was too fast. We're panicking. She's too little here. I'm looking on my phone. I hit Google, and I find out that really she couldn't tell us, but it was just 1 more floor up. So, but my wife's like, you can die from this, and so I've got an abscess, and I've got a wife, and but I, 6 years of Spanish really did me well.
And
But
how's your daughter?
everything went great. A young 22-year-old did like minor surgery on her, and they said how much, and I was like really starting to sweat. And he said $384. I was like, as fast as I could. They could have charged me $2,000. I don't know. So it worked out, but it was a challenge.
Sounds like a good family vacation story for sure.
On Tuesday.
So the point of this, I think, in my mind anyway, was that we all give ourselves accommodations. We provide ourselves with things to help us be successful. Brad Greer actually used assistive technology in his situation, so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But there's things that we do just sort of intuitively to help ourselves be successful, and that's kind of what I'm thinking about today. As far as providing services for students with disabilities, I want to make it not so high stress, not so focused on like that one individual, just more universal things we can do in the classroom. Okay, so the general why. Students with disabilities are increasingly being served in general education classrooms, and then I put in there with co-taught support for the most part. And this is in accordance with federal law. So I know some people kind of like, why is this happening? You know, this is too much, you can't take it, and I get it. But it is actually law. And the school board lever that we are following, with 80% of students with IEPs being served in general education 80% of the time, is based on federal law. Also on best practices for students with disabilities, research-based. So there's increasing conversations in the district to support this switch, so that's just kind of why we're talking about it today, and trying to support everyone as we make this change. So as far as my why, that's my dad there in the middle on his 70th birthday. And I have little kids, so like whenever we watch movies, I was like, okay, so no one dies in this movie, everyone's a happy ending. So I'm just gonna say that right now, happy ending. This is my dad now, and he's fine. My kids are in the 2 girls, the little girls there, and those are my niece and nephew. But my dad, we went on Red Ride one year, and Dad had a crash. And we don't really know what happened, but his helmet broke in 2 different places, and he was in ICU for 9 days. So, traumatic brain injury. Watching my dad go from pharmacist, Trivial Pursuit champion, small business owner, And then to see him struggling to do things like make correct change for a hot dog was really profound in my life. He had probably months of physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech language pathology, made a lot of progress. In fact, in occupational therapy one day, he practiced grocery shopping, so then Mom and I took him grocery shopping, and we did a lot of things around the house to, help him be successful, help him improve. He did retire. That helped a lot. Brought his stress level down, so he could really heal his brain. And I do think he's made a pretty full recovery. But it really highlighted to me the fact that disability is like the universal human right. If you think like, well, I'm not like super passionate about disability rights, or it's just not something I really care about. Like, you get hit by a bus tomorrow, that is going to be your passion, right? Like, disability doesn't discriminate. It's not, it crosses race, religion, gender, and disability rights can affect everyone here. I'm sure I'm talking to people in the audience that have family members or other people that you know in your lives who have disabilities. So coincidentally, at the same time that this happened to my dad, I was getting my master's degree in educational psychology. I was a gen ed teacher. I was an English teacher, language arts, but just wanted to do more. Kind of just found my way in this educational psychology program, took a class called Disability Studies, and it was just such a light bulb moment for me to learn about disability rights, to learn about the history of disability. So I'm going to cover a little bit of that today too. Oh, and if you ever meet my dad, don't tell him I talked about him today. He'd be like, why'd you do that? And I also got injured on reg ride, but it was because I was dancing too vigorously, and I caught my knee out of place. So I can tell you guys that story another time. Okay, so the core and like the bedrock of students with disabilities and education for students with disabilities comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we shorten this to IDEA in special ed. So up until the 1970s, most states had laws that actually banned students with disabilities from attending school. So I'm going to say that, I'm going to give you some time to process that, but up until 1970, laws prohibited students with disabilities from attending school. From 1975 to 1990, students with disabilities had increased access because a law was passed called Education for All Handicapped Children. But this typically warehoused students with disabilities into separate facilities. So students with disabilities would come to school, but they would be like in a different place, right? Like a different building, separate place. Des Moines Public was ahead of the times with this. Smouse Opportunity School, I don't know if you've ever visited, was opened in the 30s by Dr. Smouse. And that was a place that welcomed students with disabilities and was equipped, totally designed. Like, if you go to Smouse, it's all ramps. So that's really neat. They had like tilted whiteboards or chalkboards back then. But the crazy thing about Smouse is when you go there, you look at pictures of students, even like a student that just had a leg brace would go to school at Smouse, up until recent times. IDEA was authorized in 1990, thus ending over 100 years of exclusion of students with disabilities in public education. So I'm going to give you a chance to turn and talk to your neighbors. I know in 1990, most of us were like at some stage of schooling in 1990. I think I was in 3rd grade. So go ahead and just turn to your neighbor and talk to us about that. Like, what do you remember about students with disabilities coming to school?
I was -6.
Some people weren't alive, Sarah.
I wasn't even alive.
You weren't alive?
I was born till '96. I was -6. You're funny.
That is scary.
Come on, man. I was in the
Great.
top. I was in the Hall of Fame.
That's why. So that's why you
Yeah, I'm so.
never knew any difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on, Jerry.
Jerry was just
Yeah, Jerry. Yeah. Plus 20. It's not like it's 10. Wedding anniversary. Let's try it.
I don't know. Mr. S. Sophia probably.
Might be teacher like youngest teacher. How old? I'm 20, I turned 26. Crazy. Young. I felt young. Old.
I was got married when I felt like her. I had my first kid at 30, but I felt like, oh, you're really gonna let me have this?
You trust me to take this home?
Oh,
I can do this. I think I can handle this. The U.S. I don't know how to do it.
does anybody have any memories? We realized Mr. S wasn't alive. Is anybody younger than 26 here? Oh, okay. Yes, I thought so. Yeah. So I was like, well, that's why you're so
25.
inclusive, Luke, because you don't know any different, right? Oh, that's really cool. Now that I think about it. Does anybody have any memories of this time, Shannon?
I graduated from college in '97, so not too far off from this, but my very first special ed teaching job was self-contained, 14 students, and now, knowing what I know about levels, those kids were clearly level 1.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe just 2 or 3 years below grade level in reading and math. That's it, but they were self-contained back
Mhm.
then. Now we would never in a million years consider self-contained any of those kids.
Right. Right. And I think, even though 1990 was, 32 years ago, right? Like, we are still coming into compliance with this law. And that's okay. Change takes time. Progress takes time. Anybody else have any memories of this? Yes.
So we were just talking that when we think back to our high school experience or just to our school experience, it was like you said, the special ed kids were separated. They were in a different room, a different part of the building. We really never saw them or interacted with them. But I was sharing with them, I have a very vivid memory from my kindergarten year, and there was a special needs kid in there, and my teacher not knowing how to deal with him because he wouldn't sit still and left sheep tied into a chair.
Oh my God.
So, but that's back in 1972. So she didn't know how to deal with it. She didn't have the tools, and that's right. When I look at your timeline, that was right after they started allowing them to come to school. So she didn't have the tools to deal with him or the knowledge of what to do with him. So it's very sad. It's a very vivid memory that I have because I was in shock,
Yeah.
As a kindergartner, I'd never seen anyone tied to a chair before, but that's just how they handled it. And then eventually, as we all moved on, he didn't move on. He ended up with the other kids in the isolated. So
Yeah, it's like shocking to hear, a child was tied to a chair in 19, and then you think, like, well, okay, well, 1972, right? But we know better now. You'd be surprised, I would think. Like, I've seen some things that I'm like, no, you can't, not here. So, you can't do that, right? Because when we talk about inclusion, I was thinking about just the word inclusion. The opposite of the word inclusion is exclusion, right? And sometimes even seclusion. And that happens. Students with disabilities are sometimes put in rooms isolated alone. Not even with their students, not even with their peers with disabilities, right? Like, just, people don't know how to handle them. So, that's, again, I wanna give you those tools. I don't just wanna talk about it. I wanna to give you those tools. And so that's, what I'm here for today, and what I wanna continue to be here for you guys. Just a few more things of like the technicality of the law. There are 6 pillars of IDEA. I'm only going to talk about 3. But the Individualized Education Plan, the IEP, is described as the centerpiece of the student's education. So we in special education, it's kind of a burden, all that paperwork. It's a lot of paperwork, tons. But the IEP is a big deal because it is the plan for that student. It drives their education. I also noticed this came right from the law written in 1990, and it says it's the educational delivery system for disabled children, and we wouldn't say that now. We wouldn't write law that way now. We would say children with disabilities. Use that people first language now. Free and appropriate public education provides access to the general education curriculum to meet the challenging expectations established for all children. So a couple things about FAPE, that's what we call it. We can never say that a child is too expensive to educate, like, at all. There's no limit on that. So we actually have a student at Hoover that, if he were able to come to school, would need a one-on-one nurse, and with him all day long. We pay for that one-on-one nurse. We don't say that's too expensive. And then just to notice there that FAPE includes access to general education curriculum. That's federal law. The third, and the one you're probably hearing about the most this year, is LRE, least restrictive environment. And this is to the maximum extent appropriate. Children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions, care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled. So, talking about self-contained classrooms or separate facilities, that is not in accordance with federal law. We want students with disabilities in the general education classroom with their general education peers. If you ever want to talk about appropriate evaluation, parent-teacher participation, or procedural safeguards, that's a fun one too. We can come to my office, we can talk anytime. So as far as least restrictive environment, I think this is a pretty good visual here. The regular education classroom is where that is students' LRE, that's their least restrictive environment. If you have a co-teacher in the regular education classroom, that's still considered the least restrictive environment. That's the top, that's where we want them. Partial removal from general education, like maybe you do some pull out of that. Speaking of pull out, my boss always says, like, please never say push in. I'm like, you're right. Like, we don't push kids in, we welcome them, right? Like, welcome to this classroom. Self-contained classrooms, not where we want to be. We understand that there are some skills that need to be taught in isolation. So like Brian and Tyler, when they're working in their self-contained classroom, they're working on skills that we know can't be addressed in the general education classroom. Working on that, like on phonics, on that, like those basic math skills that they need to be successful. Separate day schools, special education residential programs, and hospital homebound are things that we don't typically use. They are there, and they're part of the continuum of services. But the idea of this is that students always return to the top. We're always trying to move students into that least restrictive environment. Okay, so as far as like something helpful, a tool for you, this my favorite thing. People get tired of hearing me talk about it, but I love the concept of universal design. Universal design came from architecture, and it also came from some sister legislation to IDEA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed at the same time, 1990. And fun fact, Iowa Senator Tom Harkin was the author of that legislation. When he presented the legislation, he presented it in sign language, so that his brother, who was deaf, could watch him. So I think that's a pretty cool story, pretty amazing. And I did sit next to Senator Harkin on an airplane one time, until they moved him to first class. My parents were like having spasms. They're like, "Do you know who you were sitting by?" So I think that is just so cool. He had a family member with a disability, grew up, became a senator, and then passed this like landmark, groundbreaking legislation. And George H.W. Bush signed it into law. And I was reading about that last night, just thinking like, that is incredible. I mean, ADA is like so expensive. Like all of the changes that people had to make to their buildings and their practices and everything. I don't even know if something like that could be passed today, but like I said, disability crosses the aisle, and affects all people of all walks of life. So ADA made all public spaces accessible. That's why you see ramps, ADA doors, parking spaces, things like that. And the idea of universal design is that we made these accommodations for people with disabilities, but they ended up helping lots of different people. So curb cuts on sidewalks, right? Those are for people who use wheelchairs. But moms with strollers also really benefit from curb cuts on sidewalks. My kids ride their bikes on the sidewalk, and that's helpful for them, right? Like, we were talking about, like, when we were kids, remember, like, you got to the curb, and, like, I would always get off my bike. But like, there's, like, those really brave kids that would jump the curb. But now you just go right over it. So the idea of universal design is that it makes things accessible for everyone, makes things easier for everyone. Brad talked about using Google Translate in Mexico. We use text-to-speech, speech-to-text accommodations all the time. A lot of those came from Stephen Hawking, really like amazing physicist, scientist, brilliant man, started to lose his ability to speak. And he had amazing, brilliant scientist friends that made tools for him to help him speak. And so that's why he uses this like infrared cheek twitch technology, eye gaze technology to speak. And those tools that were made for Stephen Hawking became like so beneficial to the public. My 6-year-old, she struggles to write. So when she's searching for a show on Netflix, she just uses that dictate button on the remote, right? So these kinds of things, they're everywhere. We don't always think about them, but they are accommodations and they're part of universal design. Universal design for learning, then, is that idea of making class-wide accommodations, breaking down barriers for the class. And I just really like this, this visual here, of the idea of it's time to go into school, the steps are covered in snow, so he's shoveling the steps and says, I'll shovel the ramp, right, after I shovel these. Well, if you shovel the ramp first, everybody can use it. So the idea here, I think, is let's build that ramp. Let's use the ramp. Universal design for learning comes from a center called CAST, and it's all brain-based research, and it talks about the idea of using multiple means of engagement, providing multiple means of representation, and then providing multiple means of action and expression. And instructional coaches and I were talking, this is something we could go deeper into. I would even love, somebody that knew more than I did, which there's lots of people out there that do, could come talk about this because it really is like brain-based, neurological, research-based, scientific, and there's a lot you can do here with universal design for learning. And we're going to try to just like skim over it today in our breakout sessions for you. These 8 guiding principles, these are 8 guiding principles of specially designed instruction, and you're probably going to start hearing about them. It's kind of we're hearing a lot about them now in our department meetings. But I just want to highlight the first 2 today. Learners receiving special education services are general education learners first and always. And highly effective special education services and outcomes are dependent on highly effective universal instruction and school-wide intervention systems. So those are the 2 I think that we can get there. We're going to be, and I think we are already making so much progress as far as inclusion. We actually do have the best numbers in the city. As far as our LRE, yes, citywide LRE competition, we are the winners, so good for us. Thank you, everyone. But I think just knowing and walking into Hoover, like seeing you all wearing your inclusion t-shirts before break, there is a very inclusive feeling in this building that I'm really proud of and really love, and appreciate you all for that. I'm going to leave you with just like a quick challenge. I really like this equality equity visual, right? It's like give everybody what they need, but does anybody know what would be even better? Yeah, take that fence down. So that's the idea, that's what we're talking about today. Break down the barriers, and I hope that you find our breakout sessions useful. And please let me know, give me some feedback on anything else you'd like to know. And thanks for listening today.
Hi. I don't really need this microphone, so. Okay, so we have 3 breakout rooms for you. So we are going to move by PLC. So if you could find your PLC on here. Co-teachers, if you could go with your content area. I know special ed is listed up here. When I put that, I was thinking teachers that teach only learning transitions or GT, like they're not in a content area. So if you're a special ed teacher that co-teaches, if you could go with your content. But find your PLC, find your room. We're gonna spend 20 minutes in each of these breakout sessions, and then we'll have a 5-minute break in between. I think maybe 9 o'clock, should we start at 9? 9 o'clock, so take a little break, 9 o'clock, find your breakout room. If you have any questions, please come find one of us.